Hello everyone and welcome to the first episode of There Goes Tokyo, in which Toho fans discuss all Godzilla films in preparation for the 2014 remake. I'm your host Merlin, and today with me I have my friend Justin here for this little journey.
How's it going, everybody?
Alright, well, let's start things off with the first and generally considered to be the best film in the franchise, the 1954 Oshiro Honda film, Gojira. The story starts out with an investigation by several reporters and a scientist to the remote island of Japan, Odo Island, where several boats have been attacked by a gigantic beast. After it is revealed that this beast is Godzilla, renowned archaeologist Yamane believes the monster was an ancient dinosaur which has been awoken and made more dangerous due to nuclear testing. The monster begins attacking Japan, and the military seems powerless to stop him. He assaults Tokyo, and nothing, no bullets, tanks, jets, or even an electric wall of fire, seem to be able to stop him. Meanwhile, there is a bit of a love triangle unfolding, as Yamane's daughter Emiko breaks off her engagement to a scientist named Serizawa, because of her love for a ship captain named Ogata. Upon telling him this, Serizawa still feels the need to tell someone of his newest invention, the oxygen destroyer, a device which can disintegrate all oxygen atoms and therefore destroy any organism. Though she is sworn to secrecy, after Godzilla levels Tokyo Bay, she begs Serizawa to come forward. With the help of Ogata, the Doctor tracks down Godzilla and uses the device to kill the beast, sacrificing himself as well, so no one can find out how to use the oxygen destroyer in the future. Godzilla is honestly one of the best monster movies ever made and is a staple of classic science fiction tales. Though the basic idea seems cliché today, Godzilla is one of the first films to utilize such ideas. Godzilla is a frightening beast to behold, brought to life brilliantly by Ichi Tsuburaya's effects team. In addition, Honda uses impressive lifelike model cities and amazing cinematography and editing to make the man in the suit seem more imposing. In addition, the shadows and amazing soundtrack help build a dark and ominous tone. Perhaps what makes this film truly stand out, though, besides the amazing special effects, is the boldness and timelessness of the underlying themes. Having recovered from the ruins of the atomic bomb less than a decade prior, Godzilla himself is an obvious commentary on the destructive capacity of nuclear warfare and of humanity itself. Godzilla is really the ultimate cautionary tale. There aren't any major negatives for this movie. The characters may not be the most complex, but the performances really bring weight to them. They are still probably the best written characters of the Honda era. I happily give Gojira an A.
Nice. I didn't even think about the romantic love triangle subplot that you mentioned in retrospect.
Really?
But that's a good point. How do you feel about that, by the way?
Well, it's funny. As we were preparing for this particular script, I actually did a little bit of research, and apparently the script was rewritten like 4 times. Originally, Yamane was supposed to be a mad scientist and was supposed to be someone who created Gojira, and then the beast ran amok. And apparently, the love triangle was kind of added in to bring more human weight to the story. I honestly did feel like it was a little cliche, but I think that's mostly because they weren't entirely sure how to make the characters work, but I think the performances kind of glued it all together fairly well. I thought it added a good component, personally.
Yeah, it's weird. They don't really develop the characters that thoroughly in the actual story, but how they are implemented over the course of the entire film just adds all this sort of great relatability, adds this great sort of creates more stakes to the actual events that unfold. Mm-hmm. But let me get to my actual review.
Go ahead.
While Godzilla may have garnished a cult following for his campier installments later on, such as evident in the late 60s and up to the mid-70s, the original Ishiro Honda film was filled with biting commentary and one truly terrifying monster. Gojira, as Joe mentioned, serves as an allegory for the hydrogen bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and as he mentioned beautifully, it's the ultimate cautionary tale. As such, Gojira takes a more human approach to the monster movie genre, focusing heavily on the struggles of the civilians amidst the death and destruction. This makes the action intense, the characters fascinating, and its ultimate goal all the more poignant. Gojira is truly an all-around classic that continues to stand the test of time, and I'm very excited to see where and how it's going to influence director Gareth Edwards in the upcoming 2014 film coming out this May. And I apologize, Joe, I didn't give my grade, but that would be easily a well-deserved A+.
Oh, wow, awesome. So you don't think that the slightly underdeveloped characters affected your grade? Because that was the only negative I thought might bring it down for some people.
Well, I mean, I see where you're coming from with that, but here's the thing, and it's arguably the best thing about Gojira. It's tackling the story from a bunch of different perspectives. We're getting Ogata, I believe you said his name was? Mm-hmm. Yes, Ogata. We're getting Yamane, who's talking about it in the boardroom. I really like the fact that they actually chose to not make him a mad scientist. I didn't even think about that, but the way that he sort of serves as more or less of a, like, this is kind of our fault sort of character is brilliant, and I thought they handled him well. I mean, you could argue that's a little bit preachy, but it's a big thing that they were able to do that in the 50s when all this was just starting to, like, calm down, one could argue.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. Do you think that this film is necessarily a film for everyone? Because I think that it is definitely a film classic for sure. And maybe that's another reason why I kind of wrestled with giving it an A+, is because as amazing as it is, I'm not entirely sure it's accessible to everyone as it was originally intended to be, because I think it was supposed to be a film that was meant to be shown to a broad audience to get the message out, and I'm not sure everyone could accept that because of maybe the campiness of the idea.
Well, it's a good question. Let me start there. I think it's accessible. It's definitely a story with a lot of subtext, as you and I have both mentioned, and I don't think everyone's going to get that. And I think there are some that aren't going to be willing to accept that the whole monster movie aspect of it is more or less trying to hit that message home even more efficiently. And it's kind of a shame, because I think that's arguably the most efficient part of the entire movie. I wouldn't necessarily say it's not a movie for everyone. I just say it's going to divide people on how much is it appreciated.
Definitely. Well, I can see that. I think we've covered Gojira pretty well. It's pretty good, and who knows, I might consider giving it an A+, but I kind of wrestled with that idea. But
it's still a great movie, right?
It definitely is. It's an amazing film, and I would highly recommend that anybody that has not seen Godzilla, especially moving up for the 2014 re-release, I think that it would be a good idea to at least check it out. But at the very least, it is definitely an amazing film.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, and moving on now, we're going to go into the American remake that came out 2 years later called Godzilla King of Monsters, and Justin's going to lead that for us.
Okay, now, in most people's version of the chronology of Toho films, this is not really considered a film, but for There Goes Tokyo, we decided to actually count this as an independent entity from Gojira for a couple of reasons. While the storyline essentially follows the same aspects of Gojira, the sequencing is heavily altered and focuses on a new American character played by Raymond Burr as Steve Martin, a reporter caught in the middle of a strange happening. And as we all know, there's a strange and unseen creature that has been sinking ships, and we're not entirely sure why. But as he decides to stay around and cover the story, he learns about the possibility of it being a monster god, obviously, as the titular Godzilla, and begins to bear witness to the monster's seemingly unstoppable force. While these changes seem to be good on paper, they're not very well executed. Burr does not give a relatively good performance, and in fact, he starts out kind of dry and gets worse as it goes along. However, the best aspect of this movie comes from the original action shown from the original film, which just begs the question of why didn't they release Gojira and dub over it? Because we've seen through kung fu movies and other things that it can still garnish a crowd. It's not necessarily the most shall I say, tasteful way of handling the material, but
Definitely.
It still would get the material out there and still inevitably grab an audience. But unfortunately, this is it's just kind of, it felt sort of like an insult to the source material, and I was kind of let down by it, to be honest with you. I remember seeing it when I was a lot younger, and even then I was kind of bored by it, to be honest with you. But all in all, I mean, just for the action alone, that from the original film, that still kind of holds that kind of grip to it, I'll give it a D+.
Oh, wow. Well, I guess I kind of disagree with you a little bit about Raymond Burr. I thought that he did an alright job trying to convey the terror of Godzilla. I mean, it wasn't a great performance, but I thought that he was kind of trying to do the best he could reading these lines that were given to him, which seemed a bit preachy. But I thought he did a passable job. And I think that some of the trips they brought to try to bring it to an American audience were all right. Some of the scenes they set up to try and interplay it, some of them worked, some of them didn't. I thought it was kind of hit or miss. Still, they cut out many crucial parts of the story, and they even wrote out certain characters. And many of these scenes created a huge impact in the original story, so therefore I think this film really loses a lot of its punch. Still, most of the good effects are still there, and the main message really isn't lost, though it is much less impressive than the original film. I'd say if you're completely unfamiliar with Godzilla, I'd still probably recommend the original. I also watched this movie when I was a lot younger, but I wasn't that bored by it. I was relatively intrigued by it when I was very young. But I do agree that it does pale in comparison to the original Gojira film. But I still think Godzilla King of Monsters is alright. Just kind of comes down to being a basic, cliche, standard monster movie. And I give it a C.
Which is kind of the reason I had a big issue with it. The beauty of Gojira was, yes, it was a monster movie, but it went so far beyond what is a monster movie. Mm-hmm. With American monster movies and other things like that, we usually just want to put some kind of funky-looking monster that somebody spent a lot of time putting together and just give them something to tear apart. Mm-hmm. Gojira just does that and so much more.
You're right. There's a lot more going on under the surface with Gojira, which is one of the reasons why it is definitely a classic. And it is something to think about.
Yeah.
But, I do agree, I think they did edit this and kind of redistribute it to try and make a quick buck. But at the same time, I did feel like they were sort of trying to capture the atmosphere and the main message of the movie, which they could have easily not done, considering the fact that it is kind of a commentary on what the Americans did to the Japanese. So I still had to give somebody some credit for that. Mm. At the end, I think it comes out as being average, but it definitely is a mixed bag.
Yeah, I'll definitely give you the writing on Burr. It may not have necessarily been his fault, but man, his material was not well. You're right. Put together.
The writing for his character left him being basically stagnant, but I did feel he was trying. It's almost like with the direction, they didn't do a good job making sure that he knew what exactly he was supposed to do. It's just like reading The Terror. Like, okay, it's bad, but there wasn't a lot of human life, but I'm not sure that was his fault.
That's, like I said, that's definitely a good point. Do you think he should have actually been in the movie, or would you have preferred a dubbing?
I don't know. I think at the time, to make it more acceptable to American audiences because of obvious things like racism and other issues, maybe that was the easier way to go for the average film viewer. So I guess I understand why they did it, but overall, I think if they had just redubbed it with some decent voice actors and kept all the original footage, it might not have been as big of a success, but it would have been a better adaptation.
I would agree with that. It's difficult to say because whenever somebody does dub over those movies, it always seems to not necessarily have the best delivery, for lack of a better word. I mean, it's gotten a little bit better today when there's a lot more people doing it, there's a lot more money in it because the foreign market's starting to become more accessible. Mm-hmm. But then it was like, let's just find Joe Schmo and see what he can do.
That's true. I mean, I guess considering for the time, voice acting was really not much of the impressive art that it's kind of become today. And when they're translating foreign films, there is a lot more time and effort understanding the culture and the original script than there was probably back in the 50s.
When you're just trying to shuck something out.
Exactly. That is a good point. I guess it might not have been the best way to do it, but I still would have liked them to try. I've seen a few decent dubs for these movies since we've watched them. But here's another idea you kind of just brought up when you asked me that question. Do you think that it's possible they could have maybe redone the film using original footage but actually making characters based on the others, trying to keep a similar tone? Admittedly, of course, maybe it might have been tricky to take it out of Tokyo and kind of put actors in there, but maybe instead just have actual American performers in that situation reacting to it in a similar way?
Yeah, that was a big thing that kind of irked me about this one. Because we got the original one from so many angles, we got a more like balanced approach to it. In King of Monsters, it's all Steve Martin. Mm-hmm. And because of that, it feels kind of one-sided.
And it kind of messes with the narrative a little bit, because as you usually know, trusting a narrator is one of the biggest parts of a story, and when you're only really getting his perspective, and he's quite literally, for about 90% of the movie, narrating what's happening with these other characters, and how we're supposed to feel when Godzilla's attacking the city, it just comes off as being kind of unbelievable.
Yeah, it's kind of like, just roll with it. Let's see what he's actually doing instead of saying, oh, the great massive force or whatever.
I know, I guess I like it from a poetic standpoint, but there's no question, it's a little over the top.
For lack of a better word, absolutely.
Yeah. Any final thoughts on that, Justin, while we're wrapping this up? It's a pretty good discussion with these two movies here.
Truth be told, I mean, while I think we're both torn on this, I still think if they had a decent script, mm-hmm. this could have probably been a better movie.
I agree.
It's just the fact that I feel like they were trying to get out a monster movie that they probably had good intentions with it. I don't think they wanted to make it gimmicky.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that they just want to do something to create a more relatable U.S. protagonist, it just kind of became a cheap ploy to that, and I kind of regret that it suffers for that. But I mean, I think it could have been more salvageable, and it should have gotten a higher grade.
I agree with you there. I think that ultimately speaking, this film, I really feel like there was good intention behind it. I really do, but it was messy, and somebody did stumble along the way. Should have gotten a higher grade. I doubt that it would have been as good, and it's certainly not as superior as the original, but
No chance.
I do agree with you. I think it easily could have been a better movie.
Absolutely.
All right, guys. Well, we're moving on now from that little double feature, and we're going to talk about the first sequel to Godzilla, or Gojira, and that would be Godzilla Raids Again, and Justin's going to take over and start off with this one.
All right, so Godzilla Raids Again. After two pilots named Shiyoshi Tsukioka and Koji Kobayashi are forced to land on a mysterious island, they discover a new Godzilla in the midst of fighting a new spiky monster, later to be called Anguirus, which was created by the same hydrogen bomb that made Godzilla. As officials try to use flares to distract Godzilla into fleeing from attacking the city, it instead decides to anger him as he and Anguirus proceed to attack Osaka. This is a sequel with a number of missed opportunities. It's desperately trying to cover the action from a number of different perspectives, similar to the original, but they all feel underdeveloped. Notably, during one scene, I want to say near the end of the second act, which kind of focuses on these kind of delinquent characters, and they were really interesting, but they literally don't go anywhere, and it completely suffers for that. But even though I sort of gave that sort of synopsis, there really is not much story here, and it's just sort of bouncing from sequence to sequence with little rhyme or reason. The best thing this honestly has going for it is the action between Godzilla and Anguirus. This is the first face-off Godzilla's ever had in a movie, and it's definitely one of the better ones. It's just, I wish it had a better story to accompany it. Watching how the two end up laying waste to Osaka is an absolute treat. It's not a bad sequel in terms of later installments in the franchise. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of fun talking about Godzilla's Revenge, aka All Monsters Attack. Little hint for later episodes, but
it's bad, people.
it's really bad. But Godzilla Raids Again just leaves a lot to be desired, and for this, I'm going to give it a C-.
All right, well, I'm pretty much going to echo everything Justin just said. I'm going to say right off the bat that the best thing about this movie is the fight with Anguirus. I mean, he's correct about that. It's got some really good balance between stop motion, use of models, and actual stuntmen. Other than that, I thought this was pretty much a fairly boring monster movie, which just sort of touched on some of the basic ideas of the first film. I do agree that there were a couple, and I mean a couple, maybe like two decent scenes with some, what were they, like fleeing war prisoners or something?
Yeah, I think they were at least inmates.
They were criminals of some kind. It seemed like there was going to be some characterization with them, like they were kind of likable and interesting. But that was literally like, I think 2 scenes, maybe not even 5 minutes the whole movie. And that's really grabbed our attention besides the fight between Godzilla and Anguirus. It's true. I did like the fact they brought back Dr. Yamane. He kind of did...
Nothing.
Basically nothing. He gave basically a shorter version of his first speech from the first film. So it was kind of nice. One of the nice tropes we'll see in recurring patterns is that apparently Honda really liked his cast members and his actors, and they must have liked him because a lot of recurring characters kind of become different characters in other films. It's pretty awesome. So that's one of the nice things we got to see, was a little taste of in this movie. But really, pretty much everything Justin said. I think this movie is mostly forgettable. Though, the fight with Anguirus kind of makes it a movie that I think you should check out basically for that. And I, too, give it a C-.
What's interesting about this one, and I believe we both mentioned it after we got done watching it, is they take unquestionably the worst part of Gojira, which was focusing on the Air Force, who apparently can't hit the bright side of a barn, and made them the main characters.
I think it was kind of a joke, actually. Like, it's sad because they're like the most incompetent people. I mean, at least the people in the tanks and the cannons were kind of aiming at Godzilla, but the people in the Gojira, there is a scene, and you can easily see it, where the planes are coming right at him, and they're totally missing him, and they're trying to bombard him, and after a while, it looks like Godzilla just gives up and just goes back to the ocean.
He literally looks bored.
It's like, wow, you guys really aren't trying, and I guess that sort of sets the standard for the military and probably mostly the Air Force in future films, because they are pretty much useless. You're right about that.
I will give this movie credit for one thing, though, and I didn't think about this until we got a couple more movies in, which is the fact that, and I don't know if this was intentional or unintentional, it does sort of set the stage for the creation of what I want to say is Infant Island, aka Monster Island, or whatever they keep using for repeat movies.
I think Infant Island and Monster Island are different, but I'm not completely sure about that. But you're right, they do set up the native islander thing.
Yeah. At least one of them's implemented for Godzilla vs. Mothra, which I'm sure we'll be talking about in the next episode.
Oh, definitely.
So, I mean, in terms of like series continuity, it's at least trying to do something to set the stage for future installments, but definitely just not up to snuff. That's
true. I agree. It's a pretty much disappointing sequel, but it does do a few things right for setting the stage, fighting another monster, some of the supernatural elements with Infant Island, and still trying to keep up some memorable human characters. I think it failed this time around, but at least we're seeing some of the beginnings.
Yeah, it's kind of a pity, because if they had added like a couple more ones and just sort of added a little bit of development, like if they had ran with that inmate story, this might have gotten a B-.
Yeah, I agree. I think that was a potentially really interesting subplot to go with. Could have really carried the movie. And also, in addition to this, one of the things that I found kind of interesting is that probably more so than any of the other eras in Godzilla's history, the Honda era is pretty much all chronological, and it all takes place in the same universe. I believe the Showa era is mostly, but beyond that it kind of becomes really confusing.
Yeah, where everyone's just sort of trying to do their own thing.
But before we end here, there is one little thing I think we forgot to mention that I think is interesting. One thing I've always kind of had a hard time accepting. And now, as we know, in the first film, Serizawa sacrifices himself and kills Godzilla.
Yes.
Now, the Godzilla we see in Godzilla Raids Again is actually another monster who just kind of suffered the same radiations. How do you feel about that? Thinking that the Godzilla that basically carries most of the first era isn't technically the first monster.
Well, it's interesting. Yes, it's kind of a cheap ploy, but let's also not forget what Dr. Yamane said at the end of Gojira, which was, if we don't learn from our mistakes, there will be some resurrection of Godzilla in some way, shape, or form. So I mean, it's interesting, and of course, as we've also seen evident in future installments, Godzilla's appearance changes significantly. I don't think that has anything to do in terms of actual continuity, but
you're right.
It is an interesting take on it.
Perhaps radiation is affecting him. That is a good point, actually. I guess the scientists didn't listen to Yamane, and they didn't learn from their mistakes, because we got a whole other Godzilla. Just kind of speaking to that point, as I was kind of reading up a little bit for tonight's episode, one of the little sidebars they noted was that Godzilla starts out, and we'll probably cover this in many future episodes, but Godzilla starts out as being this ominous force of evil representing nuclear devastation and the terrors for Japan and potentially for everybody during that time. That much is obvious. Now, this is a bit more of a character-related question. Over time, I guess reflected by the culture, Godzilla kind of slowly evolves into being a symbol of Japan's strength and becoming basically a superhero. Do you think that the original Godzilla kind of, maybe by the intention of the creators, or just maybe a combination of the culture, was originally this terrible force, and that the new Godzilla might have been a chance for redemption? Because he does become a good guy, basically.
I'd argue anti-hero, but I mean, it is a really good point. It's one that I'm really looking forward to going really into detail with. I think it's more or less of a matter of, yes, he has a lot to do with devastation and destruction and pain and suffering, but people that embrace that pain and suffering do eventually heal. And what's cool about the Honda era is, upon retrospection, is Godzilla does, in a kind of weird way, I know that sort of sounds silly when you're talking about a gigantic monster played by a guy in a rubber suit, he does actually kind of grow, and we see that evident in Ghidorah, the three-headed monster, was still really kind of stubborn, but he does do something at the end that's quasi-heroic that, I'm not going to lie, got me a little warm and fuzzy inside.
Me too, man. I just think that's kind of cool that as basic as the character is, he does kind of grow, and maybe that's just sort of speaking to the hard work and dedication and the creativity of acceptance and moving on.
Yeah.
Which I think in and of itself, even in the silly giant monster genre, really does say something.
Mm-hmm.
All right, guys. Well, I think this has been a great first episode. Please, if you love Godzilla or you know nothing about it, either way.
We want to hear about it.
Yeah, exactly. We want to hear about it. So please, let us know, comment below. And we're going to be giving you a lot more episodes all the way up to the 2014 release, which we might even do a dual review. And you can check out the full review with Dan, Justin, and myself on Film Fanatics. All right, guys. Say goodbye, Justin.
See you later, everybody.
All right, guys. Merlin out. Peace.